Então, agora eu passo a palavra à Meg Batalha, a nossa mestre de cerimônias, a nossa projetista, a criadora desse projeto Mulheres, Vidas, Entrelaçadas. Meg?
Olá, pessoal. Em primeiro lugar, eu estou muito emocionada. O coração está apertado, porque esse projeto é muito importante para nós. E eu vou começar falando em espanhol, uma frase que me tocou muito, a Norma Medina que me passou, que é por fora flores, por dentro temblores. E então gostaria de dar boa noite, boa tarde, bom dia, que temos pessoas de vários países aqui conosco hoje. E eu sou fundadora da rede internacional do Catálogo de Tradutores, é uma rede colaborativa de interpretação simultânea e de tradução. Mas eu quero agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a todos e todas que votaram no projeto Mulheres, Vidas, Entrelaçadas. O apoio de vocês foi e é fundamental para que a gente tenha a oportunidade de ganhar o prêmio do CL Tank, que vai estar no chat, para que vocês continuem votando. Também eu gostaria de agradecer a Sunita Bogle, pelo apoio ao projeto, pela masterclass de hoje, que vocês vão ficar apaixonados com a técnica e com a Sunita. Também quero agradecer a Quantum Academy pelo apoio e por promover esse projeto nos grupos de FT e de Matrix, todos alunos da Sunita. Também quero agradecer à equipe do Instituto Conhecimento Liberta, sobretudo na pessoa do Eduardo Moreira, que capitaneia estes projetos de empreendedorismo, pela iniciativa do CL Tank e pelo investimento que ele vai aportar para os projetos vencedores. Também agradeço aos intérpretes de espanhol, Mariela Andrade, Norma Medina, francês, nós temos Adriana Vieira e Mônica Guiar, apesar do sobrenome diferente, são irmãs. Também temos no inglês Cristiana Coimbra e eu, que daqui a pouquinho vou pilotar a cabine de inglês e português. Italiano temos Dorina Bonatti, Verônica Colasanto. Em Libras nós temos o grande prazer, eu sempre gosto de repetir, fomos a primeira plataforma do Brasil a incluir Libras. Temos a Celeste Hitch, Esther Chaves e Cíntia Teixeira. Gratidão enorme a todas vocês, muitas das colegas que estão aqui estão fora do Brasil, Mariela está no México, também Dorina está na Itália, e a Sunita, que é tardíssimo, lá no Reino Unido. Bem, também quero mencionar o suporte técnico da Mônica Pérez, da Sara Michele, da Janane e de toda a equipe da Mind, que é nossa, que cria toda a arte para a gente, que nos inspira e que nos ajuda em todos os projetos que nós temos. Gente, com tantas pessoas envolvidas nesse projeto de mulheres entrelaçadas, nós estamos também entrelaçados aqui no dia de hoje. É claro que esse trabalho coletivo é muito importante. Eu sou intérprete há muitos anos, acho que 15 anos, e eu trabalho em diversos setores da sociedade, mas eu me dedico muito às organizações da sociedade civil. E uma das áreas que mais me interessa mesmo são as terapias alternativas. Eu amo esse trabalho, eu amo a Quantum, amo a Sunita, e realmente eu sou muito grata pelo que aprendi com todos. Então, eu trabalho, comecei a traduzir mulheres, grupos de mulheres indígenas. Ano passado culminou na Marcha das Mulheres em Brasília, mulheres indígenas. Sabe quando você traduz um projeto do início ao fim e vê aquela mulherada de vários países do mundo ali em Brasília pedindo direitos para as mulheres? Depois, em 24, não sei por quê, eu acho que talvez seja a lei da atração, que a Sunita também conhece com a Amit Goswami, eu comecei a trabalhar com tarifas solidárias e aí começou a trabalhar, a aparecer na minha frente grupos de mulheres, mulheres de toda a parte do mundo, mas uma que me tocou muito no coração era uma mulher da Argélia, que recebia fundos de doadores de várias partes do mundo. Ela disse que ela não conseguia trabalhar nos projetos de educação porque o trauma que as mulheres com que ela trabalhava era tão fundo que ela não conseguia chegar no nível de educação ainda. Então, ela estava trabalhando nas feridas, nas dores dessas mulheres. Então, por onde eu olhava, eu pensava como que eu posso empoderar as mulheres. E aí, numa conversa com a Sunita, assim, do nada, eu falei, nossa, eu estou trabalhando demais com mulheres. E a Sunita falou, nossa, eu adoraria trabalhar com mulheres também. Então, fiquei com aquela coisa na minha cabeça, né? Daí eu comecei a fazer o curso Empreendedora Mestre do ICL Tank, do Instituto Conhecimento Liberta, e nesse processo lançaram o ICL Tank. O que que é o ICL Tank? É uma iniciativa do ICL que apoia financeiramente projetos que vão gerar impactos positivos na sociedade, para que todas as pessoas tenham o seu lugar de fala. Então, estamos nesse processo aí de votação intensa para ver quem é que vai ser escolhido. Todos os projetos são legais. Se eu ganhar, vou ficar muito feliz, mas se não ganhar, outras pessoas vão ser com certeza qualificadas e vão fazer projetos incríveis também. Bem, o projeto, então, para quem que é? Para quem que é esse projeto? São para pessoas que, de alguma forma, elas sentem que algo dentro delas as impede de desabrochar e usar o seu potencial humano. Eu tenho o privilégio de dizer que eu uso muito o meu potencial humano, então eu sempre me pergunto o que falta, o que que impede essas pessoas de brilharem, terem uma vida plena e feliz. Então, o projeto é focado em mulheres, tá? Mas não só mulheres, porque tem outras pessoas vulneráveis que também precisam desse projeto, desse processo de transformação, de ter poder pessoal, de poderem se expressar como elas quiserem. Então, o nosso projeto tem uma metodologia que a gente está trabalhando. Claro, se a gente ganhar, tem possibilidades de ganhar o primeiro prêmio, segundo, terceiro. Então, o projeto vai ser trabalhado conforme esse prêmio que a gente ganhar, né? Bem, primeiro, nós pensamos em trabalhar com um grupo de 20 pessoas, tá? Esse projeto teria o acompanhamento de 4 terapeutas formados pela Sunita, com a supervisão da Sunita, e a gente trabalharia de uma forma bem suave, para realmente trabalhar as questões mais suaves desses 20 participantes, tá? Então, depois dessa primeira fase, que seria uma fase de trabalhar com uma conscientização das pessoas. A Sunita vai poder explicar isso melhor também para vocês. Nós iríamos para uma segunda fase. Nessa segunda fase, seriam sessões mais individualizadas, conforme o perfil das pessoas que forem sendo absorvidas pelo projeto. Bem, ao final de cada fase, nós nos comprometemos a ter dados para falar o que nós estamos fazendo, ele tem uma base científica, é comprovado, as pessoas realmente se sentem mais empoderadas, elas sentem que algo nelas foi transformado. Esse é o objetivo principal do projeto, né? Então, nós vamos usar as técnicas de FT e de Matrix, conforme a necessidade dos participantes. Nós vamos ter um apoio do ICL também, um apoio de marketing, de divulgação, para que a gente realmente possa ir adiante, e também o apoio da Sunita Bugal, que é uma profissional que eu vou ler o currículo dela para vocês. Mas antes, gente, eu quero dizer 3 coisas que eu acho que aconteceram ontem, que eu acho extremamente importante. Uma é que nós temos uma mulher presidenta do México. No México, nós temos 2 colegas do México aqui. Isso é uma coisa incrível, uma mulher presidenta no México. A outra questão que eu achei muito interessante ontem foi a marcha LGBTQIA+, e que as pessoas diziam, nossa, é a primeira vez que eu sinto que eu posso andar de mão dada, que eu posso abraçar, que eu posso beijar meu namorado, minha namorada. Uma rua enorme e as pessoas vestindo verde e amarelo, mostrando que é possível cada um respeitar a diferença, mesmo que você seja vulnerável, ou que a sociedade te deixe se sentir vulnerável, que você tem o seu lugar de fala. E é isso que nós queremos com esse projeto. A outra questão que eu achei muito interessante foi um jogador de futebol brasileiro que se chama Vini, que virou um herói. Não é um anti-herói, ele é um herói verdadeiro, porque ele é uma pessoa que veio das classes mais baixas, classes sociais mais baixas do Brasil, e ele virou um herói. Ele é um homem negro, que ele foi atacado diversos jogos na Espanha, e ele foi o cara que fez o gol em Wembley, no Reino Unido, e por isso ele tem o seu lugar de fala também. Então, esse projeto ele é muito amplo. A gente vai começar, a gente vai, como a gente fala em inglês, dar o kick-off do projeto, e com toda a segurança que possível, porque as pessoas cada um tem a sua questão, vamos trabalhar com as pessoas conforme as necessidades de cada um, tá bom? Bem, eu vou ler o currículo da Sunita. Ah, tem uma coisa, o currículo de todas as intérpretes estão no chat, que nós temos intérpretes de francês, vocês podem passear pelos idiomas aí, intérprete de francês, de espanhol, francês, eu já mencionei o nome, né? Francês, espanhol, inglês e italiano, e temos as belíssimas intérpretes de Libras, que é língua de sinais brasileiras, não é linguagem, línguas, guardem isso, é muito importante, que também estamos incluindo pessoas que têm deficiência auditiva, caso o projeto precise também, ok? Bem, a Sunita, maravilhosa, ela nasceu em Londres, ela tem um diploma em hipnoterapia, aconselhamento psicoterapêutico, ela fez um mestrado em estudos da consciência, espiritualidade e psicologia transpessoal pelo Aleph Trust, na Inglaterra. Ela está fazendo o curso em psicologia do trauma, ou já se formou, depois ela vai dizer. Talvez é terapeuta com vasta experiência, há mais de 15 anos, acho que desde sempre ela já nasceu terapeuta. E ela tenha um interesse forte na visão do mundo quântico aplicada a práticas psicoterapêuticas. E se formou em FT e Matrix Imprinting diretamente com a pessoa que idealizou, que é o Carl Dawson, nome difícil. E também é a única terapeuta autorizada pelo criador da técnica a ministrar o curso de Matrix no Brasil. Vale a pena quem se interessa em trabalhar com cura. Também tem 2 livros, Psicologia Quântica e Ciência da Felicidade, com o físico indiano Amit Goswami, e O Poder da Mente. Ela é conferencista internacional, realizando palestras na Índia, nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil. Também é professora na Quantum Academy. Então, com isso, sem mais delongas, Sunita tem a palavra.
Hey guys, awesome to be here. So Maggie, yeah, really interesting what you were saying. It's always heartening to hear, isn't it? People that, get access to funding and can't necessarily use the funding. Because there's trauma in the way. And I think, like for me, that was really important to hear. So I'm hoping that what we're going to be able to do with the start of this masterclass today is really kind of get our heads a little bit around really what the basics of the mind are, a little bit about trauma and a little bit about how we might be able to break that. Okay. So as Maggie said, my name's Sunita. I'm a psychotherapist and a trauma specialist. I'm also an energy psychology practitioner. I've been in this profession now for around about 15 years. And prior to this, I used to be a teacher. So I have been on my own journey of healing trauma with an eating disorder many years ago now. And I tried a lot of modalities along the way. So I've done a lot of talk therapy, hypnosis, meditation, went up the spiritual route. I tried quite a lot of things. And it wasn't really until I started working as a therapist. And one day I encountered a client who, long story short, I couldn't actually help very well because I was using the traditional techniques, which have their place, but weren't very effective with trauma. So this kind of really, I would say maybe divine intervention forced me into a place where I had to go back and study and retrain in energy psychology techniques. One of these, which I'm actually going to be introducing to you a little later today as we get into the today's webinar. Okay. So I think really the biggest thing for me while I was on my own journey, healing journey, and also as I've trained, I would say hundreds of practitioners now in how to use these techniques, I think it was really about understanding more about myself. So who was I and how did I function? And the more that I understood who I was and how I functioned, the better I was able to help myself. And this is really what I would like the masterclass today to start to bring to you, because I think that, you know, when we really understand who we are as human beings, who we are as energy bodies, we really stand in a better position to knowing what we have to do to actually work towards healing ourselves. Okay. You know, I've often wondered what my journey would have looked like if I would have had this information at the beginning. You know, I'm not saying that the information is suddenly going to solve all of your issues. But if I was to be born with a manual in my hand, tonight's information is definitely something I'd want to be in that manual, right? Okay, so I hope you guys find it as useful as I have. So let's get going. Actually, guys, you know what I do want to say before I get started? If there's one thing that you're going to take away from tonight, just one, it would be this. Healing is possible even if you have a history of trauma. It may take time and it may take a skilled therapist, but healing is possible when you have access to the right information, the right psychoeducation, the right level of safety, and the right tools, right? And I think that, like I said, even if you don't take away anything else, take away that healing is possible. So the three things that I'm going to cover with you guys today, the first thing is going to be teaching about the conscious and the unconscious mind. The second is going to be, I'm going to teach a little bit of trauma in this as well. And the third is going to be introducing you to emotional freedom techniques, EFT, a little bit about what it is. I'll go through a very simple protocol with you. And by the end of this session, you should have a good enough roadmap of where you'd want to go if you wanted to begin the healing journey and if you have a history of painful experiences or trauma. Okay, so Monica, can I get slide 2, please?
Quando eu vou abrir de
Okie dokie, we're ready to go, guys? Maggie, or am I good to go? Okay, right, so folks, coming back. Nearly coming back. Hold on a moment. Okay. So my specialism is, like I said, in trauma and belief systems. And what I've come to learn over the years is that trauma is a whole being experience, okay? And it will impact the mental, it will impact the emotional, it will impact the physical bodies. There is also a role that intuition plays as well, but we're going to focus mainly on the physical, the mental, and the vital, which is also the emotional body, as I work through with you today, okay? And what I found is that when we remove, guys, the energy from these painful experiences, we can remove the emotional feeling that comes with these experiences, the triggers, the mental aspect really calms down. So the best way that I can explain this is if you think about, you know, if you've ever had anxiety before, usually, how do you know you've got anxiety? Yes, you will have anxious thoughts, but alongside that, you will also have feelings in the body. So you know, people often describe anxiety as I've got butterflies in the stomach or I've got a fluttering chest. So it's a very visceral feeling that comes along with the anxiety. Now, what we know is that if we can use certain techniques, if we can get rid of the physical feelings, the visceral feelings that come with the thoughts of the anxiety, it actually becomes a lot easier to manage the thoughts themselves, okay? So the tools and techniques that I use predominantly, they really work very well with the physical and with the emotional body, and also with the mental, because like I said, the mental becomes a lot easier to handle once the vital and the physical have been dealt with, okay? So the two things that I will say is that we've got to first of all release energy that we hold as a result of experiencing trauma and painful experiences. And the second thing is that we have to be specific. And I'll come to that a little later. All right. Specificity, guys, is really, really important, because when we're specific in the way that we're working with painful experiences and traumas, what happens is that we send a direct message to the brain to let the brain know that the event is over and that effectively we are safe. Okay, safety plays a massive role in the processing of trauma, because quite often when we have these really painful experiences and when our mind and body, you know, when we remember those painful experiences, it literally kicks on our nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system is switched on, and we end up in this kind of state of being fight or flight a lot of the time. So what these techniques, well, what EFT will do for you is start to actually calm the brain down, and it starts to bring your nervous system back into balance again, so that you're safer, you're calmer, and you can effectively operate you know, from a relaxed state, which is really what you're looking for when we're talking about trauma. Okay. Right. So can I have the next slide, please, Monica? Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm going to start off by looking at the conscious and the subconscious mind first, very briefly. Okay. So I'd like to introduce something called the stick person here. Now, I didn't actually create this particular image. This was an idea that was put forward in 1934 by somebody called Dr. Thurman Fleet, but it's a brilliant image to be working with. And I think it really helps to break down the conscious and the subconscious mind. Okay. Now, let's just start off with looking at the conscious mind first, all right, which I've outlined on the left-hand side of the screen. So the conscious mind is also known as the thinking mind. It takes up roughly, on average, kind of 5% of the mind, okay? It processes around about 40 pieces of information per second, and it's our critical mind. So it, you know, although it only perceives a tiny amount of the vastness of information that's being processed, it has the ability to still be quite critical. You know, we have the ability to, we have choice with our thinking if we're utilizing it in its most optimum form. Okay. And it's also where we make our conscious decisions. So our yes, no decisions. All right. So fairly straightforward, the conscious mind. A lot of the mainstream therapies, like talk therapy, for example, quite often is centered around using the conscious mind. Right now, I want you just to keep something in mind here, folks. If we're using a therapy that is using predominantly the conscious mind, look at the percentage that the conscious mind makes up. It's roughly 5%. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind as I move through and look at the subconscious mind. All right, I'll come back to that point in a moment. So your subconscious mind is also known as your emotional mind. All right, so it makes up to 95% of the mind, and actually it runs the show most of the time. All right, I just want you to think for a moment about when you first kind of learned how to drive a car. All right, so to begin with, you had to consciously pay attention to everything, pressing the clutch, gears. What happened after a while? It became an automatic response, right? So before you knew it, you know, you were driving from A to B, and you can't even remember getting to your destination because you've been thinking about other things all whilst you've been driving. All right. So the subconscious mind does a lot of things in the background. It regulates our body. It's constantly scanning for danger, and it's processing million bits of information per second. All right. It's also a database of all our experiences, guys. So there's evidence that suggests, for example, that we have memory from when we're in the womb. Now, from a experiential perspective, I would definitely agree with this, because I've been doing this work long enough now to know that sometimes when you have access to the right tools, people access memories from very, very far back. And, you know, I've had clients that have gone back to the womb to access memories. I've had clients that have kind of claimed that, you know, some of their experiences seem to be coming from past lives, you know, and there is actually research. I know that Professor Ian Stevenson, for example, he was a pioneer into the research of reincarnation, specifically to do with children remembering things from previous lives. Okay. What do I think about this? Well, I guess I've been studying parapsychology and transpersonal psychology for quite a long time. My view generally tends to be, if it's coming up for the client, it needs to be addressed. So I'm not too bothered about, you know, where it's coming from or what it is that's coming up. What I'm most fussed about is if something's coming up, you know, it needs to be looked at, it needs to be dealt with. And this is where tools like EFT, you know, can be very, very useful. I could do a whole webinar actually on past life stuff and energetic stuff, but I guess that's another topic altogether. So let's come back to the diagram. Now, so what happens is, guys, we take in information via our 5 physical senses. So you can see them there at the top of the diagram: taste, touch, smell, sight, and hearing. Okay. Now, as we receive that information into our conscious mind, there you can see at the top, okay, we can either accept or we can reject that information. So, for example, if we've been taught that the sky is blue, and if somebody comes up to us and says that the sky is green, we're going to argue the case, right? And the reason we're going to argue this is because from childhood, we have learned that the sky is blue. So this is our critical thinking coming into play. We've been programmed with the information that the sky is blue, and it's been further validated by the fact that others also have the same belief: the sky is blue. So that particular belief sits in the subconscious, so everything is aligned. Okay, now here's the important thing. When we're born, guys, our subconscious mind is still under construction. Okay, so it's slowly developing. So there are certain things that our subconscious is good at doing, such as regulating the body, keeping us alive. But the mental aspect, it's still under development. All right. And usually this development takes place at a very, very fast rate from the ages of 0 to 7. So our main beliefs that we hold, believe it or not, a lot of them are actually formed by the age of 7. Okay, I can't remember which famous philosopher it was, actually. It might have been Aristotle, I can't remember, who said that if you give me a baby, at age 7, I will give you a man. And he obviously understood that, you know, all of your major programming is done during those formative years. Okay. So now, if you were raised in a family where you were constantly told that you were stupid, that's what you're going to begin to believe about yourself on some level. Conversely, if you were brought up by carers or guardians that respected you, you're going to have better self-esteem. Okay. And again, this is where standard talk therapy won't necessarily be able to go. You're going to need some energy techniques to be able to get into that space, to be able to access those memories, to be able to release the energy, and then to be able to turn those beliefs around. Okay. Now, as we get older, we're able to reject some of the ideas coming in, but if you think, guys, you know, when you're really, really small, you don't reject certain ideas that you're told. So if you're being given the message, for example, that you're stupid from like 1 year old, 2 years old, you're not old enough to understand or even to fight back that, no, this isn't true. So in those early years, whatever message is coming into your mind, whatever's coming into the subconscious, they tend to build solid beliefs during that time. This is why the formative years are so important. Okay. So yeah. So when we're adults, although we do have a conscious choice, we usually make these choices in line with our belief systems. The issue arises when we make different choices. So, for example, if we want to change a habit, we might try and use all of our conscious ability to change that habit, but it can be very, very difficult because when we present a new idea to the subconscious has years of habitual thinking in there, and it fights back. And guys, it fights back with 95% power. All right. So for example, if you have grown up and if you have taken the belief that I'm stupid, let's say that's what your caregivers programmed you with, right? If you have taken that in and then suddenly you get to like, I don't know, 25 and you decide that you want to change that programming. If you then start telling yourself that I'm intelligent, you know, I've achieved quite a lot, there may be a slight problem because as you're saying that to yourself, everything that's sitting in your subconscious, which is the belief of I'm stupid, is going to push back. You don't just think you're stupid, you feel you're stupid. And that's where the problem is. Okay, so, you know, this is why, again, I'm going to come back to why we need tools like EFT, because we've got to work very, very skillfully with the energy that we feel about ourselves. When we can release that energy, it becomes easier to reprogram a new belief into the system, right? And trauma works in the same way. So if we've had experiences that we've perceived to be traumatic, right? Even though we built that perception, even though we built a particular belief system in place, it is something that we can release if we have the right tools on hand. It's an energy that your body is holding. It's a memory. It's an energy. It's got a vibration. It manifests as an emotion. It manifests as a set of thoughts. Remove the energy from the experience and you will be able to reprogram a new belief in. Okay? So now, interestingly enough, I've spoken quite a lot about kind of the ages from 0 to 7. Now, beliefs, they're not only formed in childhood. We can also continue to form beliefs in adulthood through repetition of behavior. So each time we're repeating an action or a behavior, we strengthen a particular belief. Another way in which we form a belief is through the experience of trauma. So when an event occurs that we perceive to be traumatic, it's so shocking that quite often it will bypass the conscious mind and it goes straight into the subconscious. Okay. And at that moment that traumatic experience goes into your subconscious, you are going to form a belief or a decision at that moment. Right. This is really important. And what happens to you is that at that moment that you form that belief or decision, literally there's a part of you that freezes, literally. Okay. And depending on the number of different factors, this can show up in different ways. So, you know, people might experience this later on as flashbacks or intrusive thoughts or constantly feeling anxious. And again, I come back to talk therapy alone is not going to be enough for this. In fact, in some cases, it may even re-traumatize the person. And this is why we need tools that work on the level of the whole being. Remember what I said at the beginning, guys, trauma generally and painful experiences is a whole being experience. It impacts us on the mental, the physical, and the emotional. Okay, so it's very, very important to be able to work through those different levels to release the impact of painful experiences and of trauma. Okay, it's a very, very, very specific process that we use to release the energy, which realigns the mind, the body, and the emotions. Again, create safety, and calms down the nervous system. Okay. So why do we experience unpleasant symptoms? Why is it? Why do we get the anxiety? Why does that happen? So this is because the subconscious mind has a survival instinct etched into it, all right? Which basically means that it will do whatever it can to keep you alive, and it does whatever it perceives to keep you okay. So for example, if you imagine that Joe Bloggs was mugged at knife point, right? So, you know, the bit of an assault that happened. And let's say, for example, the person that was doing the mugging, the assaulter, was wearing a red t-shirt. Okay. Now, luckily, Joe manages to escape and he gets to a place of safety. But 2 weeks later, let's say that Joe goes to the mall, and without knowing, remember that the subconscious processes millions of pieces of information per second, somebody walks past Joe in the same red t-shirt. Joe doesn't realize that this has happened, but Joe starts to have a panic attack. Right. Why? It's because when the actual assault happened, the subconscious mind logged everything that happened and everything that was around Joe at that particular time, right? So the clothes that we're wearing, the sounds, the smells, everything got logged down in Joe's subconscious. 2 weeks later, when Joe goes into the mall, and when the subconscious realizes that there's a person who's wearing the same colored t-shirt, suddenly the brain activates and says, oh, it's not safe here. Look, the person's wearing the same colored red t-shirt. That event might happen again. And without Joe recognizing that this is happening, he starts to experience symptoms of anxiety and goes into having a panic attack. Okay, so quite often the mechanisms that we have in place, you know, especially like the symptoms that we have of like anxiety or panic attacks or phobias, they are designed to keep you safe. They're even though the symptoms aren't very nice to have, but the actual manifestation of that is quite often a response to an experience that you've been through, and it's designed to keep you safe. So even if you have had experiences of trauma, you know, the symptoms you might be experiencing is your body's way and your mind's way of A, trying to keep you safe, and B, trying to process that trauma. The more that we understand about how the nervous system works, how the mind works, and how to calm the body and the brain down, the easier it becomes to start to process some of those traumatic events. Okay, so understanding the role of the subconscious is super, super, super important. Understanding the way that we're programmed is paramount. Okay, so now let's have a look. Let's do a little bit more work around trauma. So Monica, next slide, please. So what is trauma? Let's have a look. Okay, now decades of work in the field of trauma have generated lots and lots of different definitions of what trauma is. All right, I personally quite like this definition from SAMHSA. I think it encompasses trauma quite nicely. It's quite an easy to understand definition. So SAMHSA talks about the 3 E's of trauma: events, experiences, and effects. Okay. So let's just have a look at the event first of all. So an event is basically any circumstance that may include actual or extreme threat of physical or psychological harm. So for example, natural disasters, violence, or severe life-threatening neglect for a child that interferes with healthy development. These events, they can be single occurrences or they can be repeated over time. You know, guys, generally, I tend to say that if it's something that's life-threatening, we tend to call it a big T trauma. And if it's anything else, we tend to call it a small T trauma. Quite often, interestingly enough, big T traumas can actually be easier to work with, because quite often big T traumas, if it's a single event, it can actually be quite easy to clear. It might just take a few sessions. But if you're working with complex, like repetitive big T traumas, that can take a bit of time. And also, if you're working with small T traumas as well, that can also take a bit of time. So small T traumas can be anything that may seem insignificant to you, to others, but not necessarily to you. So for example, if you have, let's say you've got a slight complex about having a lot of spots on your skin, for example. Let's say you've got really spotty skin and you're very conscious about it, and there's a party that you have to attend. You go to the party, you're really nervous, you've plucked up a lot of courage to go there. You arrive and your uncle says to you, "All right, pizza face, how's it going?" Now, in that moment, everybody else might kind of laugh at that comment, but for you, that could have actually been a bit of a traumatic experience, a painful experience. So we would call that small T trauma, okay? Quite often, we have a lot of small T experiences that happen throughout our life, and they quite often contribute towards some of our core belief systems that we hold, okay? Right, the second thing about trauma is experience. So it's actually the individual's experience of these events or circumstances that help to determine whether or not it's a traumatic event. Now, it's important to recognize, guys, that traumatic events are actually experienced differently by different individuals. Okay, so for example, a child removed from an abusive home may experience the event very differently from their sibling who's also been through the same thing. One might experience it as a trauma and the other might not. How an individual labels and gives meaning to an event, and also how they're disrupted physically or psychologically, will contribute to whether or not it's experienced as a trauma. Okay. Effectively, guys, what happens is with trauma, that traumatic events actually set up what we call a power differential. All right, where one entity, whether it's an individual or a force of nature, has power over another. And this quite often leads to the question of why me? All right, so it's very much kind of puts us in that space of powerlessness. Okay, there may be feelings of shame, guilt, betrayal, humiliation, which really shape the experience of the event. Okay, now how we experience events are linked to a number of factors. Our individual and cultural beliefs will play a role. Our support system around us. You know, guys, it's been shown that people that experience a traumatic event and go back to a safe family or a friend environment quite often recover from the trauma quicker than people who don't, or people who feel isolated. You know, and so having that support network, even if you're going through therapy and as we're doing this work, it can be a really important part of recovery if we can set one up. Okay. So yeah, that's what I'd say. But overall, it's why one person perceives a trauma differently to another. We're not exactly sure. I think that there are lots of factors in the background. You know, our natural personality types, our previous trauma profile, all of these things, I think, really play a role into how we might perceive a particular event. Okay. So the third E of trauma is what we call the effects. So the long-lasting adverse effects of the event is a critical aspect of trauma. These events may occur immediately or may have a delayed onset. You know, it's really interesting. When I first got into this work 15 years ago, I did a lot of work with car accident victims over the phone. And it was a really, really good experience because it taught me to really listen for, you know, what a person was experiencing, because I couldn't see them. I was working on the telephone. And very, very quickly, I learned to pick up very subtle cues like, you know, if somebody was on medication or not. Quite often, after doing a few months of the work, I could quite often tell if somebody was on medication or if they weren't. But one of the things that I picked up, which was really, really interesting, was that I used to think that, okay, a traumatic incident occurs like a car accident and these symptoms will come on really quickly, right? that wasn't always the case. Sometimes it would be like 3 months or 6 months before the traumatic symptoms actually came into play, right? And this was quite often sometimes a problem because the client would say, I don't understand, everything's been fine. All of a sudden, I've had these symptoms that have come up. And they didn't make the link between the symptom and the event, right? And the reason for that was because it'd been so much time before the event had actually passed, right? So it's important to recognize that if you have experienced, kind of like these symptoms that have come out of the blue, these traumatic symptoms that have come out of the blue, and you can't think of what's happened recently, it may be that there's a delayed onset in the of the processing of the trauma. There was another really interesting book, actually. I was reading about a very famous post-mortemist doctor here in the UK, and he wrote that he'd seen some of the most horrific cases he'd worked with, that he'd performed post-mortems on, and he was absolutely fine, and his post-traumatic stress symptoms did not set in until 20 years later. Right. So just, it's just an indication, just kind of showing you that, how far along the line that you can have the actual event, and then the symptoms don't kind of creep up until a lot later. So I think that's quite an important point. Okay. Okay, just looking at the time. Right, Monica, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, just want you guys to have a quick look at this. Right, just want to really spend a couple of minutes literally looking at what happens in the brain when we experience these traumatic events. All right, so you can see there the reptilian brain, which is in the brown. You can see the limbic system, which is in the red. Okay, and you can see the neocortex there, which is in the blue. Now, the reptilian brain, the brown bit, this maintains your basic bodily functions. The limbic system, which is the bit in the red, which is the one that's actually most relevant to trauma, this is instinctive, and it deals with fear and it deals with pleasure. Okay. The neocortex is the most sophisticated. It's the place of logic, imagination, planning, control. So when we talk about the conscious mind, generally speaking, it's the neocortex bit that we're talking about, generally speaking. And when we're talking about the subconscious, we're kind of talking about the limbic system and the neocortex. All right. The key part of the brain when we're talking about trauma is the amygdala, which is a key part in the limbic system. Okay. And the amygdala's job is to actually sense danger and set off an alarm. So when we're in a very threatened position, it's the amygdala that kind of senses that there's danger, it sets off an alarm, and this is why we have the symptoms come up, the adrenaline rush or the cortisol gets started, and we're getting ready to go into fight or flight. Okay, and this is what you need to remember, guys, and this is absolutely crucial. The key element is that we do not have control over this, right? We don't, when we go into fight or flight, it's an instinctual response and we don't have control over it. One of the things that people that experience mental health issues, especially anxieties or panics or trauma responses, they quite often say, I can't help it when it comes on. When people tell them to calm down, they'll often say, I can't, because I don't know. I go into freeze response. I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to calm down. And it's because we cannot control this response. It's very quick and it's designed to keep us safe. And we don't have control over how the amygdala sets off. All right. It's a defense mechanism. It's a survival instinct mechanism. Okay. So when that part of our brain gets activated, when that limbic system goes on and that amygdala gets triggered, right, this is what happens. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so when that amygdala gets triggered, there are 4 types of survival responses that may occur, all right? Now, it's not that you're going to just have one of these. You could have more than one of these occurring, okay? And they are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Now, fight is when you subconsciously, you've assessed the danger and you're getting ready to fight. So if you think about having a bear back in, caveman times, you've come across a bear, your subconscious knows it's in danger, and it's literally trying to assess, can I fight the bear or can I not fight the bear? So if you can fight the bear, you're going to fight. If, however, you can't fight the bear, the next thing that's probably going to happen is your body is going to flight, all right, which is when you will run. So you're going to try and run from the danger because you can't fight it. So you're going to run. Okay. Now, what can also happen is you could also go into a freeze response. Okay. So freeze response is when the subconscious decides that it can't fight, it can't run from the situation, and you kind of enter this kind of self-paralyzing response. Okay. Quite often what happens in this response is that the body actually shuts down and it stops you from experiencing the panic, the horror, the anxiety, the fear, the dread. All right. In fact, it also turns off your pain responses. So if you've got like a wolf that has sunk its teeth into you, your body has switched off some of the pain responses and you may not actually feel that happening if you've gone into a freeze response. Okay. The other thing as well, guys, is that freeze responses don't always have to look like very obvious freeze response. If you've had, sometimes what can happen is you can have a trauma, you can have a freeze response, but it's happening on the inside. And so what happens is on the outside, you look like you're quite calm and you're dealing with the situation, but on the inside, you might be having a freeze response. Okay. So this is super crucial because all of this is obviously affected and affecting your nervous system. Okay. And the 4th response that's outlined there is called the fawn response. All right. So the fawn response is basically known as a pleasing response. So for example, if you have a child that has grown up and has been neglected, an abused child, they've kind of grown up in this unsafe environment, the child learns very quickly that it can't fight because it's too young. It can't run anywhere. Now, it might freeze, but it also learns that if I just try and please the abuser, maybe the abuser won't treat me so badly. Okay. And so as we get older and as we grow into adults, sometimes this can look like extreme people pleasing. All right. There's quite a lot, actually, I could teach a lot more on this about what it looks like when we grow up and, what belief systems it contributes to. But for now, what I want you just to remember is that, you have a traumatic response. The amygdala gets activated and you go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Okay. Right. Next slide, please. Okay, so very, very quickly, right, when that amygdala alarm goes off, what happens is the part of your brain called the hippocampus that usually files memories, okay, temporarily shuts down. So if you've had a traumatic response, it's quite common for people to say to you that I can't remember the sequence of events. It's blurry. I can't remember exactly what's happened. Okay, and that's because the hippocampus has temporarily shut down. Now, what happens instead is we still remember things, but we might remember them in a very sensory form. So we'll remember colors, we'll remember smells, we'll remember sounds, or we'll remember sensations. This is also why we need energy psychology techniques, because when we have colors, smells, sounds, sensations, sometimes we don't know what the memory is, but if we can feel that energy in the body, even if we don't know what the memory is, it's possible for us still to release that particular perception of the traumatic events. Okay, so coming back to the idea that if you've had a traumatic experience, Because trauma affects the body as a whole, it makes sense to address the whole of the body when looking at healing methods. All right. So, you know, especially when we're looking at the emotional level and the physical level, somatic therapies, EMDR, EFT, matrix re-imprinting are really, really good tools to start to work with this. All right. So I've not got long left. I want to introduce you to a bit of EFT. So can I get the next slide, please? Lovely. Okay, so what is emotional freedom techniques? So far, guys, you should have understood that painful experiences or trauma are whole being experiences. You should have understood a little bit about the conscious and the subconscious mind and the fact that the subconscious drives everything. You should have understood that the conscious mind is the thinking mind, the subconscious mind is the emotional mind. You should have understood a little bit about what a trauma is, what happens in the brain and the body once we experience a traumatic event. And you should have a basic understanding of the fight response, flight response, fawn response, and the freeze response. Okay, so now imagine if you've experienced something traumatic, you've got to remember that every part of your body, so on some level, your body, your physical body will remember the feelings, your emotions will remember what emotion was felt in that moment, and your mind will be affected by the thoughts. So if you're triggered into the same memory again, you're going to find that that memory's it almost comes alive. So you'll think about it, you'll feel it, and you'll sense it in the body. Okay, this is why right at the beginning I said that talk therapy is going to have its limitations. So one of the tools that I use to release some of that trauma is called emotional freedom techniques, also known as EFT. All right, so let's just have a quick look at this. So emotional freedom techniques is a relatively new discovery based on ancient healing principles over 5,000 years ago. All right, so it's taken from influences from Chinese, Shaolin, and Taoist monasteries. It's basically the Eastern healing arts of acupuncture, acupressure, shiatsu massage, and reflexology. All right, so all of these ancient kind of healing modalities were based on something called the meridians, and meridians are known as kind of, you know, your energy systems. And the idea is that what happens is when we have a trauma, we have a blockage in our energy systems. So what the EFT does is when you tap on certain parts of the body, it literally releases the energy that is blocked. Okay. So next slide, please. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Monica, Maggie's asking, can everybody hear
Perdão,
the
gente,
interpretation okay?
eu vou ter que descompartilhar para tentar fazer de novo, porque ele travou de novo. Me perdoe, só um minuto, por favor.
Okay. Can they hit? You don't know if they can hear it, Maggie?
Não, esse modo aqui.
Sure. Let me know when we're good to go.
Só um minuto. Por gentileza, todos estão com acesso à interpretação. Eu peço que para o pessoal do Brasil, que não estiver acessando ainda, procure o globinho na parte de baixo do seu computador ou do seu celular, pode passar o dedo no celular ou o mouse na tela, e acesse ao globinho. Ali você escolhe o idioma que você quer ouvir. Temos a tradução para o português, diretamente do inglês, e a tradução do português para italiano, francês e inglês. Aliás, inglês é o original, tá? Muito obrigada. Qualquer dúvida, podem escrever para mim no chat.
We good to go? Okay, so emotional freedom techniques, what is it? Right, it's an emotional version of acupuncture, but without needles. Okay, so it's a unique exercise that calms you so you can think more clearly about your problem. The difference is it's more focused, all right? So it's also known as tapping. Emotional freedom techniques is also known as tapping, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. All right, so let's have a look at the tapping points. Right, so guys, you're actually going to have to put the video on me now while I actually explain what the is. Okay. Now, folks, so I'm going to introduce you to the tapping, right? Hold on a moment. Maggie, can we have the video on me for this, please? Because they're going to need to see me. Yeah. Okay, right. So EFT, right, is basically a system of tapping on certain parts of the body. So I'm going to introduce you to the tapping points. But here's what I am going to say, guys. Look, if you've got a history of having a lot of trauma, I would advise you to take it very, very easy. And if you feel that stuff starts to come up, stop. Just stop what you're doing. You can always come back and look at the tapping afterwards. Most people are okay when they start to tap. Some people might, you know, kind of feel a few uncomfortable things that might start to come up. But like I said, if that's the case, just stop. Okay. One thing that I will say, there are lots and lots of different videos on the internet on how to use tapping. A lot of them, I would say, probably don't teach it the way I think it's supposed to be taught. Tapping, I think, is really an art. And I think we've probably got some of the practitioners that we've trained on here today as well. And they'll attest that tapping really is an art. And we got to make sure that we're safe when we're using it. All right. So if you find stuff's coming up, stop tapping and just watch. Right. Rest of you, I would encourage you to actually tap along with me. I'm going to introduce you to the first protocol of tapping, the first part of tapping, just so you've got an idea of what tapping actually is. If you find yourself yawning, very, very normal, because what tapping actually does is it calms the amygdala down. It releases neurological tension from the brain, and it causes your parasympathetic nervous system to come online. So it's very good at getting rid of tension. Okay, so the first tapping point is here, side of the hand. So if you just tap there for me. Okay, side of the hand. Just very, very lightly, like a butterfly. Okay, 6 or 7, 8 taps each time. All right. Next tapping point is here, top of the head, your crown. Okay, good. Next tapping point is top of the eye here. So if you just have a look at the eyebrow, okay, it's just the top of the inner part of the eye here. Next tapping point, side of the eye. Okay. Next tapping point, under the eye. So if you can't remember this, try and remember it as the eye triangle, okay? Next tapping point, under the nose. I know it seems really bizarre. Seems very bizarre. The only thing that I'm going to ask you guys to remember is my first degree, guys, was in maths and science. So believe you me when I say that I'm actually very scientific. It took me years to believe that this stuff actually works. My bad. I should have got it quick. I should have done it quicker, because it is fantastic at releasing traumatic patterns, right? Next tapping point is under the mouth. Okay. Next tapping point. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. Right. If you've got your collarbones, you'll be able to feel there's two kind of like ball-like structures there. Choose any side, roughly about an inch underneath. Tap. Okay. Good. Right. Next tapping point is under the arm. Ladies, where your bra straps are. Men, if you wore a bra, where your bra straps would be. Okay. Now you could do it like this, or you could do it like this. Up to you, whatever's easier for you. Okay, under the arm. Right, next tapping point, across the wrist. So not on, across. Meridian runs across the wrist. And your next tapping point are your fingers, so top and bottom. 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 Okay, right. So, and then we go straight back to the side of the hand again. We'll do it one more time. Top of the head. Okay. Top of the eye. Side of the eye. Under the eye. Under the nose. I'm curious to know, is anybody feeling tired at all? Put it in the chat box if you've started yawning or if you find that memories are coming up. Stick it in the chat box, guys. Under the mouth. Collarbone. Under the arm. Yeah, so Sarah, you might be triggering into something, sweetheart. So if you're kind of like triggering into something, stop tapping because it does open up your energy field. Okay. Across the wrist. And your fingers. Right, if you have got some symptoms that have come up, and if they're quite light symptoms, you might just want to carry on tapping for a little bit longer, and you might find that the symptoms might actually settle down. All right, so that's a very, very, very quick introduction into EFT. Okay, and like I said, what it actually does, we've actually got a lot of gold standard, good peer-reviewed studies now to show that what happens when we actually tap. And what happens is the part of our brain that regulates the fight or flight response calms down. We've actually got brain scans to show this. In fact, here in the UK, I think it's been nearly we're hitting 17 years of really, really good scientific study in this area. So we're actually hoping that at some point fairly soon, it's actually going to be introduced into kind of mainstream therapy. Really interesting, actually, guys. So during COVID, I actually accessed funding with some colleagues to work with the police force. And I basically designed and tested an EFT protocol with trauma within the police force, and the results were pretty amazing. I've still got to get that study published, actually. But the point is that don't be fooled by the simplicity of what this tool is, because when it's used effectively and it's used with a lot of focus, it works with the whole of your energy system to remove the trapped trauma that you have got blocked. Once that's removed, you can actually go in and we can begin to reprogram and put new beliefs in place once we've actually gotten rid of the triggered responses that you're feeling. Okay, so I hope, God, I'm top of time actually, guys, so we'll take a few questions. I hope that's given you some idea into how the mind works, what trauma is, how it gives you, how it's a whole being experience, and also introduction to at least one tool that you know that if you use, you will begin to release energy from the body. And that's taken almost 50 minutes. So, you know, it does go a lot deeper, but we really hope that you found it useful, and at least it's given you some roadmap of where to go if you want to start working with trauma. Okay, or painful experiences, doesn't have to be trauma. Maggie, should we take some questions? I think.
Meg,
Yeah.
temos uma pergunta da Selma, se é só fazer a sequência de toques.
Okay, that's a good question. Right, so what I've introduced you to here is a very, very bare, basic form of tapping, okay? I would seriously advise that if you've got a history of trauma, find a practitioner to work with or learn more about how tapping actually works. So I actually train this twice a year in Brazil, where I train practitioners or I come and train people even if you just want to learn to use it for yourself. There's actually quite a lot involved. You've got to take care of safety first. There's a very, very specific way of using the tapping to actually work with memories of trauma. Now, if you have the tapping sequence alone, and if you tap for kind of 15, 20 minutes every day, or if you're feeling a little bit anxious, more than likely it will actually reduce your intensity of what you are feeling. But if you want to use it to actually reduce and really, get rid of the trauma, you probably would need a little bit more guided intervention on how to use it, simply because when we experience trauma, it can be hard enough sometimes to hold the trauma. So it really is good if you have a practitioner in place that will help you to actually shift that trauma through in a safe and ethical way. Okay. It takes time, guys. It's an art. It takes an art to develop, but once you get into the flow of it, it really, really is beautiful.
Muito obrigada. Temos mais algumas perguntas. A Sunita falou sobre a duração, né, de 15 a 20 minutos. A Marta perguntou sobre a frequência. Então, quantas vezes, enfim, nós podemos fazer essa sequência. A
As often
Elisa
as you
também
like.
perguntou sobre a frequência.
Okay, as often as you like, right? As often as you like, you can use this particular treatment. Maggie, is it okay for me to just mention Quantum Academy and Quantum Play quickly? Because there's some more resources on there. Okay. Okay. So, guys, actually, I do a lot of work with the Quantum Academy with EFT. I train EFT. I do a lot of work with them. They have a platform called Quantum Play, and there's quite a lot of EFT guidance and kind of classes that are on there that I've taught over the last probably couple of years, including how to use EFT in a very distance way. So, I did some research back in 2019. Did you know it's actually possible to do EFT on yourself for the benefit of another person? So there's actually ways to actually do this. And my research was looking at, what conditions that the therapist needs to actually build within themselves for that for that distance healing to actually work. But if you're asking how often as you like, I would probably say 15 to 20 minutes every day is probably a good time to start. But also if you're anxious at any point, please do kind of just use it for a period of time, and it will start to reduce some of your symptoms.
A Janane perguntou se os toques devem ser sempre do mesmo lado ou se eles podem ser alternados, lados alternados.
Okay, so tapping's very forgiving. It doesn't matter. You can choose to use it on one side. That's perfectly fine. You can also use both sides, which can be quite therapeutic for some people. That is fine. You can switch sides as well. That's fine too. The main thing is that you just keep on going. I usually find it's easier to do it on one side because it keeps it more organized, but whatever works for you. Totally cool.
Tiro sim, só um minuto, por gentileza. Por enquanto, não temos mais perguntas. Só um momento. Nós vamos receber a Meg novamente.
Okay.
Meg, veja, por gentileza, se você já pode falar. Não estamos ouvindo. Agora sim, peraí, eu vou fazer o seguinte, eu vou encerrar as cabines e abro de novo sem você, eu acho que é mais seguro, tá bom?
Encerrar.
Deixa eu
Ok.
ver, acho que agora foi.
Agora
As
estou
meninas
aqui.
continuam na cabine, é isso?
Beleza. Sim, pode
Ok,
continuar com as meninas, porque Sunita precisa de tradução. Então,
sim.
pessoal, muitíssimo obrigada a todas e todos que participaram. Eu acho que foi intenso, muita informação relevante, importante. Nós estamos ainda trabalhando no projeto em si, não é? Então, o que a Sunita fala, que o mais importante é ter toda a segurança para trabalhar com as pessoas. Por isso que nós temos um projeto com 4 sessões iniciais, trabalhando em questões mais leves, poder pessoal, para que vocês, cada um tome consciência daquilo que sente. Uma das coisas que nós vamos fazer, em agradecimento a todos que estão aqui conosco, nós vamos sortear, se a gente ganhar o prêmio, nós vamos sortear. Para quem quiser, pode mandar um e-mail para nós, megbatalha@gmail.com, repetindo, megbatalha@gmail.com, para que vocês possam mandar o e-mail. Eu gostaria de participar da primeira fase do projeto, ok? E nós vamos sortear uma vaga no projeto, assim como para todas as intérpretes que estão aqui e também para as intérpretes de Libras. Então, quem quiser, vamos dar esse presente, porque eu acho que a gratidão, ela faz a energia fluir para todas as direções. Gente, eu acho que é isso. Nós vamos chamar a Manu, que é da Quantum Academy, para dar algumas palavras finais aqui para nós, e a
Eu posso
Sunita quiser também.
aproveitar, Meg, que você vai chamar
Claro.
a Manu,
Uhum.
porque a pergunta da Adriana talvez tenha tudo a ver com a Manu, tá? Ela perguntou agora se o tratamento à distância, né, que a Sunita estava descrevendo, se está explicado no site que ela mencionou, que eu acredito que seja o da Quanto.
Is Chris translating for you, Sunita, about distance EFT that you have said before? Can you listen to Chris or not?
Quer que eu responda, Meg?
I can hear you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A Cris está
Yeah,
traduzindo para a Sunita, que a cabine está funcionando
yeah,
novamente.
correct. Yeah. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, I've done a session or two. It is, isn't it, Manuel? It's quite a good session as well. That one. It's quite in depth. I think we did it over 2 sessions. So yeah, I believe so. 3. Oh, okay.
Beleza. Então, pessoal, nós temos 51 participantes, batemos 52. Nós vamos divulgar todo esse material, tá? Tá no YouTube. Nós vamos fazer pequenos shorts para que outras pessoas possam escutar, se interessar, votar no projeto. E eu creio que, com tanta gente formada no Brasil, somos mais de 10 turmas, a Manu pode falar, acho que deve ter 300 filhotinhos da Sunita por aí espalhados pelo Brasil, treinados em FT e Matrix, e se o projeto ganhar forma, nós vamos ter essas intérpretes maravilhosas, novamente agradecendo a todas as intérpretes presentes, francês, Adriana e irmã, Mônica Guiar, espanhol Norma e Mariela, que está no México, italiano Dorina, que está na Itália, e a Verônica Colasanto, e na cabine de inglês vocês escutaram a Cristiana e a mim, e as intérpretes de Libras, copiar o nome delas, é Celeste, Esther, Celeste Esther,
É
Mônica me lembra,
Cíntia.
e Cíntia,
Cíntia.
Cíntia Teixeira. Meninas, muito obrigada, gratidão enorme, e novamente agradeço ao ICL Tank por essa grande oportunidade. Sunita, would you like to say something? To say
I guess
whatever you want to?
the same thing that Manuel's just said, guys, vote. It's a very good cause. And you know, one of the things that I kind of think we got to make this world a safer place. If it's not just for our generation, for the next generation, and how we're going to do it, one person at a time. And so the more people that we can get to vote, the more we can get this work out there. We've trained some fantastic practitioners in Brazil, and you know, we've got excellent tools, we've got great opportunity. Vote, let's use it, and let's make a difference in the world. We're only here for a short space of time. Let's do something with it. So yeah.
Isso, exatamente. Obrigada, pessoal. Boa noite. Tem uma musiquinha aí que a gente quer oferecer para vocês, para a gente fechar a noite. Gratidão. Boa noite.
ha dado tanto, me dio dos deseos, que cuando los abro, perfecto distingo lo negro del blanco, y en el alto cielo su fondo estrellado, y en las multitudes al hombre que yo amo. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el sonido y el abecedario, con él las palabras que pienso y declaro, madre, amigo, hermano, y luz alumbrando la ruta del alma del que estoy amando. La 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 gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el oído, y en todo su ancho, rábanos y días, ríos y canarios, martillos urbinos, ladridos chubascos y la voz tan tierna